Well, on behalf of the Otto Burns Public Library, we're thrilled to have with us this evening Dr. Arnab Roy. He is going to be speaking to us tonight, and we're excited to be able to offer this virtual programming that gives us a little bit of a more in-depth look at literature. This November, we are looking at world cultures and celebrating diversity here in Northfield. We do have quite a few Indian families who are part of our community. And so this is really exciting for a lot of us.
Thank you so much, Aubrey. This is really a pleasure to be speaking here today. I was actually a little bummed out when the program back in March didn't work out. But then COVID, as terrible it has brought some new opportunities of connecting, and I'm so glad that we could finally arrange this, and I'm happy to be speaking here today. Hi everybody. My name is Arnab Roy. I'm a professor and a researcher of literature. I work in my area is broadly modern South Asian literatures, and basically after 1950s. And I look at a range of things. One of my specializations is human rights and how literary writings advance ideas and notions that are compatible with human rights laws, human rights articulations around the world. And today's topic is something that connects with that centrally, and we'll talk about that. In a little bit, I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation ready for you guys. So today's topic is literature, revolution, and social change, and how South Asian women are at the forefront of all these three things. And I'm going to talk about how in the past 50 to 100 years or so, women have come to the forefront and expressed, have written, have published, and not just for aesthetic outputs, but have used writing to make a statement about society, about culture, about identity, and so on. So let me just begin by sharing my screen. Okay, here it is. Okay. Okay, can you all see it? Okay, awesome. So this is the title page. The topic is literature, revolution, and social change. South Asian women at the forefront. The three images that you see are the covers of some works that I'm gonna get more into as we move along in today's presentation. So before I get into the good stuff, I wanted to begin by establishing the scope and the aim of today's talk. And I would like to begin with feminism. And probably most of you have heard about the scholar, the philosopher Bell Hooks. So I've she is an activist, she is a writer, and she has her views about politics, philosophy since mid 20th century inspired and influenced feminist political thinking, not just in the United States, but I would say globally. So, so I would like to set the tone for this presentation by offering the definition of feminism laid out by bell hooks. And especially because feminism is a very misunderstood, in my view, it's a very misunderstood concept. Often people wrongly assume that feminism is just about women, or it is anti-man or anti-something. And I'm just gonna go ahead and say all that is wrong. And that's why I feel that to talk about contributions of women in South Asian literature, I just want to begin with a basic discussion of feminism. So Hooks kind of like says that feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. She says that she likes this definition because it does not imply that men are or were the enemy. By naming sexism as the problem, it went directly to the heart of the issue, right? It implied that all sexist thinking and action is problematic, right? Now, sexism is, of course, can be palpable and like visceral in like interactions, but it is also something that is systemic that you don't necessarily see, but it still exists. For instance, wage gap is a pretty glaring example, right? In many professions, I would say a majority of professions ranging from like academic or industry or Hollywood, there's often like a disproportionate data that shows that men earn more than women. So that's an example of systemic sexism at play. No one man or no one woman is responsible for it. It's a whole social outlook. It's a whole social system which is geared towards making a particular population in our society, putting them at a disadvantageous place. Also, another outcome of systemic sexism is if you look at representation or contributions of women in history, or just if you look at history of literature or anything, you would see that people are more, we know men and their contributions way more than we know women and their contributions, right? If you look at the history of Indian literature, right from antiquity to today, I mean, you will see men dominate for thousands of years. I mean, yes, there are women, but nearly not even close to the number of men and their contributions that we know about, right? So there is an issue. So once we are aware, once we become self-aware that there is a problem, we should probably, the next step comes in, how do you address that problem? Because clearly, the fact that in the past 1,000 years, we have heard more about contributions by men is not really reflective of the intelligence of women or their contributions. It is more reflective of how society has actively overlooked writings by women or contributions by women. So today, a big task is to rediscover history, go back to the roots and see what were those voices that were lost in time? What were those contributions that never made it to the light of day because they lost a political argument, but because they were hushed up, because powerful men of that time thought that this is too inappropriate, right? So today, that's a big task that scholars, historians, cultural critics have to rethink history and come out with those and reinterpret, rediscover it, taking into consideration some of those lost voices, right? That is one task. The next task is thinking about the future, right? Trying to ensure that what happened in the past is not repeated. So trying to ensure that we recognize, acknowledge, and honor the writers and thinkers and philosophers that we have today, right? So this is the dual task that feminist scholars, literary scholars, thinkers have tried to advance. So in this talk, I will of course be focusing more on the second aspect, right? Like who are some of these women who are at the forefront of literature, society, and social change and bringing revolution through their ideas and through their writings, right? However, I do wanna, from time and again, go to the first point about rediscovering history, right? And in fact, my first example is one such work that got lost in history. This work, just a second, comes from the southern parts of India. Here the poet is Madhupalani. And her work, and this is actually a book. It's a book called Radhika Satyavanam, or it's in the translation is Appeasing Radha. So this is a work that still is largely lost in history. Many don't know about. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So Appeasing Radha it's a book, but it's actually a long poem. So it was compiled originally in the 18th century in the form of a book. It was composed, this poem was composed by the Telugu speaking poet Madhupalani. She lived between, estimate, I mean, we don't have like an exact date, 1739 to 1790. And I've kind of included like a couple of stanzas from, translated stanzas from her poem. And you can see it. And her poem is about the amorous associations between the god Krishna and Radha, his companion, also aunt, and a lover. And the two stanzas that you see is the speaker is Krishna here. And you can sense there's a playfulness, eroticism, pretty evident in these lines. And again, it is following a few classical traditions. One is the Sanskritic classical traditions of literature, and again, it's a very by following classical traditions, I mean, there are certain rules through which poetry was considered to be good while composing. And this is coming from a scripture on dramatics called the Natya Shastra. Again, so which said that a valuable work of art must produce rasas. Rasas is a Sanskrit word for juice. And juice is it's a vulgar translation. I would say a more appropriate translation is extract. So according to the Natya Shastra, a good work of art would produce emotions in the form of extracts. And these emotions could be, the Natya Shastra lays down like 9 different emotions: joy, anger, lust, happiness, jealousy, right? So according to Natya Shastra, a successful work of art is that can produce these different rasas in balanced proportions. And Madhupalani kind of was able to create poetry and provoke many of these rasas that the Natya Shastra referred to. So this image that you see is an image of Krishna and Radha seated in a terrace. Nobody really knows who composed it, but roughly it came from 1750 to 1790. Okay, well. Okay, so this work of art, this work of literature after the 18th century was lost until the beginnings of the 20th century, when another literary scholar, Bangalore Nagaratnama, she was a woman scholar. There's an image of her right on your screen. She was a poet, a literary scholar, a Carnatic singer, classical singer. It's a Carnatic style of singing. It's a particular style of classical music from the southern parts of India. And she was also a courtesan. Courtesan was not, I mean, it had negative connotations, but mainly it meant she was a professional dancer in the court of the king of Mysore. And Madhupalani, the literature that we were talking of before, Madhupalani was also a courtesan and a literary figure. Madhupalani was a dancer, and many of the emotions that she achieved through her dances, she tried to bring it in her poetry. So Nagaratnama rediscovered this piece of lost literature and said, wow, this is amazing, right? This is something that needs to be published. Like, there are many male literary figures who dedicate their entire lives in achieving these different classical rasas, but they fail. And look at this piece of literature that achieves them so effortlessly. Why is this not studied? However, unfortunately, patriarchy happened. Many contemporary scholars who were men said there were harsh oppositions. And one of the comments I kind of mentioned here, a prominent social reformist and novelist of the time, from Andhra. He said, Madhupalani is an adulteress. Of course, those negative connotations of courtesan is at play here. Many parts of the book are such that they should never be heard by a woman, let alone emerge from a woman's mouth, right? So Nagaratnama was fighting a lost battle. She tried her best. She put forward the most compelling logical arguments. But what do you do when you're trying to fight the irrationalisms of patriarchy, right? And on the top of that, the British intervened because at this time, I'm talking roughly at the turn of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. India was colonized and under occupation by the British, so it was the British government, right? So the British government intervened and said, yes, this is not proper, it is not moral, it's immoral. And the work was censored, banned in its original form, and castrated heavily. All the erotic references and all the beautiful rasas were removed. And there were still some editions available, but those editions were like nothing in compared to the original. So this is one story that I wanted to bring to you of a voice that history consumed and digested. This is just not, this is just not one individual case. There are so many. So again, a big task for us is to look back and try to identify and highlight those voices like Madhupalani, who lost the historical battle, whose voices were suppressed because of patriarchy. Okay, canon versus canonical versus non-canonical. Now, depending on your familiarity with South Asian literature, you would recognize the images on the screen, at least some of it, right? If you are into South Asian literature, you would know all the four figures. If you are not into South Asian literature, you may know one or two at least, right? So here we have Tagore, Jhumpa Lahiri, Salman Rushdie, Arundhati Roy, figures who come from South Asia, who have written about South Asian, but they have kind of acquired a global canonical status. By canon, I mean they have acquired that status that many people today know of, right? So if you think about South Asian literature, these figures might be some of the names that you will first think of, right? But that does not mean this is the only South Asian canon that exists. And that is part of my aim today, to familiarize you or acquaint you with some lesser known writers from the South Asian literary canon, whose contributions still, as you will find out eventually, are so immense that they should be known globally. Their works are as important as the ones that you see on your screen. And and I mean no disrespect to any of the folks that are in this group. In fact, like many of these figures I work on, like Tagore, for instance, my personal dissertation, at least 30% of it is on the work of Tagore. But again, we need to also know some of the voices who don't yet have global recognition. And that is, again, something that I want to do today. Okay. Now, India, I'm guessing most of you are familiar with the pace, and it's a big, it's a lot. So when somebody says literature from modern India, it is often like hard to define what does that mean. Because I don't remember who said it, but I think it was a fair observation that if you look at the diversity in India, it is way greater than the combined diversity of Europe. So there are hundreds of languages, and that is just languages. I'm not even considering vernaculars and dialects, which makes it way more. Cultures that coexist, but are so different. Oops, sorry, my cat is kind of. Anyway, there are different customs, like radically different customs. The food that is eaten in North India is almost alien or unfamiliar to people in South India, and vice versa. Like the food that is eaten in the West is so different from the food that is eaten in the East of the country. So there is no one kind of literature from the nation of India. So when we talk about literatures, we have to think about various things. Now, I've kind of pointed out, made some broad points. I mean, of course, to cover all these, I would need like 1 hour each for each point, but I'm just gonna like quickly go over some of them, right? So when one thinks about modern Indian literature, one thinks not just about what writers from India write about today, but also how does one classify those literatures, right? We all need to classify literatures. There's one kind of literature as opposed to another kind of like, to really study literatures, you have to be able to like organize it, right? Like literatures that talk about, that come from the South as opposed to literatures that come from the North, literatures written by men as opposed to literatures written by women, so on and so forth. Literatures that are written in one language as opposed to other languages, right? So there has to be some kind of an organizing principle. And these are some of the organizing principles that I feel are relevant. Colonization and its impact. So India was colonized for about 300 years, I think even more than that. And different parts of India experience different levels and intensities of colonization. For instance, metropolitans like Calcutta or Delhi were the hubs where the British set up their shop, right? So that is where the British were pretty much hands-on. What is happening here? What is happening in Calcutta? What is happening in Delhi? But there were suburban regions in India, which were away from those metropolitans, where British did not have a direct control. So those places were controlled by local governments from India. that answered back to the colonial overlords, right? So yeah, so colonization and its impact. And after independence, which happened in 1947, after 300 years of colonization, what happened after that? How did India cope? They did not cope in the same way. One part of India, one state coped in one way, the other place coped in another way. So all these factors pretty much determine the kind of literature produced in these different regions, right? Decolonization and post-colonial reconfiguration, right? Decolonization is, what did the government, the independent government of India do after 1947 when it gained political independence? What did the Indian government do after that to gain self-determinacy, to gain independence, to gain a sense of I would say, to be on their own, right? What projects happened, right? And these questions of decolonization also have an impact on the literatures produced in the last 50 to 100 years or so. Identity politics, right? Now, identity politics, there's so many different identities in India. We look at caste. India is, there are so many different castes in India. Caste-based identity, class-based identity, economic status, social status, genders, sexualities, right? Whether you live in a metropolitan or whether you live in a regional province, all these, whether you're a Hindu, whether you're a Muslim, whether you're a Christian, whether you're Sikh, right? Whether you're Parsi, so many different religions in India, right? And all these different religious identities, all these different cultural identities, all these different linguistic identities. So there's so many different languages spoken across the subcontinent of India. They have a deep impact on the way literatures from different regions of India are produced, right? Tradition versus modernity is another factor, right? Now, once India gains independence, it has been sufficiently westernized, I would say, right? Western culture has made big inroads, right? What do you do with that? Can you return to those cultural origins, those cultural pasts that were once existent in India before colonization happened? Can you reclaim your tradition? Or are you westernized and are your traditions lost in this new reality, in this new post-colonial reality? That is another question that literatures from modern India have grappled with, right? Again, I've already rediscovering the past, right? Now, many modern writers think back to the past, but they often do it in different ways. Some of them romanticize about a past that they want it to be. Others say, oh no, that's too ideal of a past. This is how it really was, right? But again, these are all hypothetical scenarios. Of course, there is history, there is documents, but literature often imagines how those histories and documents were alive, right? So again, a preoccupation is rediscovering that past. English versus vernaculars, right? Colonization brought English and it became a very important language in India. It is, well, it is a language today that kind of unites India, because the North and the South and the East and the West, there are different languages. And, and, and the reality is they don't speak all the other languages. So there is no way to communicate. So English is that one language that connects different parts of India, right? But again, with English, like there's always this fear that are our vernaculars getting lost? Can we reclaim those vernaculars? Is English a language that we must resist because it's a language that represents the colonizer? Or have we reclaimed English in a way that we have made it our own? Right? So this is another another point that preoccupies Indian writers. I have a couple of things, but I do want to quickly, I'm looking at the time, because if I don't, I can keep on like going and going and going. I don't want to do that. I want to get to the main point. So let us directly get into some of the contributions that we're talking about here. I'm going to talk about 3 authors particularly. You see them in your screen. And before I get into the particular works, I want to talk a little about why I chose the title for this talk: Literature, Society, and Activism, or Revolution, or Social Change, right? Now, I mean, authors and writers are not obligated to write for the society. I mean, they can write just for aestheticism, just to create beautiful poetry or to write beautiful prose, right? And many do so too. But I mean, that's a debatable thing, but I mean, it is a position, at least. I mean, literature does have a social impact, directly or indirectly. But in the 20th century, because of the socio-political situation, because of globalization, because of colonialism, because of rampant social inequality, because of gender inequality, because of inequalities of sexuality, literature is hardly just an aesthetic phenomenon. It is a social act. And women particularly have used literature to make powerful social points. Now, India is often considered as one of the world's largest democracies. Now, democracy is a concept that we are at present very engaged with, trying to save it. And trying to save democracy means being able to recognize and give visibility and voice to those who do not have equal opportunities, those who are the weakest links in the society, those who don't have the same rights. So many of these women that I'll talk about have used their works to not just create beautiful prose, but also to empower and give voice to some of the weakest and most overlooked populations coming from the subcontinent of India. And in that way, they have fought tirelessly to make India a democracy, how it's supposed to be. It is supposed to take care of the weak, the vulnerable, the marginalized. So without further ado, let's get into the first text. The first writer that I want to talk about, her name was Rokeaya Shekhawat Hussain. Here's a picture of her. Or she was also known as Begum Hussain. She lived between 1880 and 1932. So when I say modern literature, I mean literatures that were produced from the 20th century, right up till now, I would say. Modern, now we call it contemporary. So there's kind of a divide between what is modern and what is contemporary, but those divisions are still very flexible and loose. So you can still use writings that are happening today as modern. So we're talking about like 100 years or so. So Rokeaya Hussain, Begum Hussain, was writing at the beginning of the 20th century. Again, this was a time when India was first of all unified. That is, there was no Pakistan or Bangladesh. And India was under the occupation of the British, right? So Begum Hussain, if you want a geographical location, she comes roughly from Bengal, which is east of India. Though, if you look at the map, they call it the West Bengal. But it is in the east of the subcontinent. So she comes from Bengal, but she comes from East Bengal. That's why they call it West Bengal, because East Bengal now is Bangladesh. So back when she was writing, she was a part of India. But now she's a part of Bangladesh. And that is one of the reasons why I chose South Asian and not Indian, because some of the writers that I wanted to talk about, they are like, we share these writers. We share their glory. So somebody like Begum Hussain is equally important for India as she is important for Bangladesh. So the image that you see is from, it's a recent image from one of the most important universities in Bangladesh, University of Dhaka. And she is a beacon of education. She is a beacon of women empowerment. And she's a role model for many educators in the subcontinent. And I'll give you and I'll tell you why. She is widely regarded as a pioneer of women's liberation in South Asia, at least in those initial years. But not just like women's liberation in general, but she had like a specific goal, right? Her goal was to educate Muslim women coming from Bengal. She founded the first Muslim school, girls' school in Calcutta in 1911. And she founded the school at a time when families did not easily send their girls to school. So this was not an easy task. So she canvassed from house to house in Calcutta to convince parents on why they should send their little girls to school and educate them, which was a huge task because she was met with a lot of resistance. But ultimately, she was successful. And her legacy still is felt in Bengal today, in Bangladesh and in India, right? And then she went ahead and founded the Muslims Women Association in 1916, an organization, an NGO that advocated for women's education and employment, particularly Muslim women, because during that time, early parts of the 20th century, economically, Muslim populations in Bengal were disproportionately at a disadvantageous position in comparison to Hindus. So yeah, this was her life's goal. And she used literatures to express many of her views. So these are of course not all her works, but just some of her works. Mati Chor is A String of Sweet Pearls is a collection of nonfiction essays that kind of talk about where it is like similar to Adrienne Rich's essay on why educating women is important. Why education, why anti-sexist, anti-racist education is important. So she wrote some essays that kind of highlighted why it is important to educate women, especially Muslim women. And those essays are in this collection. Sultana's Dream is something, it's a science fiction. It's a particular favorite of mine, and I'll talk a little more about it in the next slide. Padmarg, Padmarag, Essence of the Lotus. Again, it's again a literary work that highlights how middle-class Bengali women must be educated and must be aware of their rights. And The Confined Woman again talks about how women of Bengal must try to resist patriarchy. This one, she was against, she was a modernist. She was educated, she knew English, she had a Western persuasion. So a part of her advocacy was advocating women against the Parda system, though I can also think of other women writers from the time who advocated for the Parda but Ruqayya Hussain said women must step out of their pardas, from their veils, and embrace a freer existence. So these are some of her notable works. Sultana's Dream is one of her popular works in terms of its content. It's a feminist utopia. So the story, it's a short story. It's about a place called Ladyland, in which women run everything and men are secluded. So in real society, men have the freedom to do whatever they want. And women are often, at least in certain traditional families, in both Hindu and Muslim households, they are confined to certain parts of the household. They are not supposed to come out. They're not supposed to interact with people, especially men in the outer world. They are not supposed to take public roles in society. So those divisions were pretty clear in her mind. So she wrote Sultana's Dreams, where she reversed this order. She imagined a society where women were in control and men were confined to the seclusion of their household. And this was her story. So, and surprisingly, I mean, we all know utopia. I don't know, many of you would probably, the most recent example of a utopia is Wakanda from the Marvel universe, right? a society where people who we historically understand as marginalized power, have power to make real change. And it is a social critique, right? So Sultana's Dream is one of the earliest examples of feminist utopias recording in any language. It's a big thing. One of the more prominent utopias that we know about, feminist utopias, is called the Herland, by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. But Herland was written in 1915, and Sultana's Dream was written 10 years prior to that. So yeah, this is a very important work. Just this fact should make Sultana's Dream a global phenomenon. So I felt that we should talk about this. Okay, let's move on to so yeah, I mean, I could discuss more about Rokhaya Hussain during the Q&A part. So now I'll move to the second one. Again, I said, like, these are like very, like, I had to like, I usually, the text that I've chosen here are usually the text that I teach. And usually a Rokhaya Hussain text that I teach in class usually takes 3 classes, each class being 2 hours long. So I've kind of had to like squish it in a 10 minutes discussion. So yeah, so of course I am happy to talk more about it like in the Q&A session. The next writer that I want to bring your attention to is Ishmat Chugtai. Again, a very influential and revolutionary thinker, philosopher, activist, writer that the world should know about. I mean, in their own particular communities and groups in India. In India, she is a pretty popular and famous writer, but not many people know about her at a global platform. And I think that needs to be changed. Okay, so Ishmat Chugtai lived between 1915 and 1991. She's a revolutionary Urdu novelist, short story writer, and filmmaker. She was. Urdu is a language that developed in India, but its origins are Arabic, particularly because of India's rich history, Persian history, rich Persian influences in culture. So Urdu, Ishmat Chugtai, it is also a prominent language that is spoken in Pakistan today. But it is spoken in northern India. It is spoken majorly in northern India. In fact, my hometown, I come from a place called Allahabad in India. Urdu is one of other than Hindi, Urdu is one of the major languages of the region in Uttar Pradesh, Allahabad. So, and she comes from, originally Ishmat Chugtai comes from the same region I come from. So her being an Urdu writer makes sense in that sense. So she is a revolutionary Urdu novelist, short story writer, and she was all of these. She wrote stories about female sexuality, femininity, women's rights, and middle-class Muslim cultural and domestic life in modern India. She's also, Urdu literature is predominantly, Urdu language is a romantic language in that sense. Urdu literature is more generally known for its beautiful poetry. It's soulful ghazals. But Ishmat Chugtai kind of breaks from that canon. Ishmat Chugtai's writing were as realist as it can get. She was not into romanticism, but she was into harsh, realistic scenarios, right? And her work today is considered as one of the most important contributions of modern Urdu literature. She was also a staunch Marxist. Many fondly remember her as Urdu's wicked woman or Lady Chengiz Khan. Wicked woman in the sense that she loved to rock the boat in that sense. She loved to shatter the patriarchy, even if it meant that she got herself into trouble, which she did on many occasions. And she was very strong. She was not one to give up easily because of criticism. If she believed in something, she would fight for that cause till the very end. And we'll see an example of that. And she in her lifetime, she was the recipient of many awards, including the Padma Shri awarded by the government of India, one of the highest literary awards, civil awards from the country. Okay, here are some notable, the list of her works is like endless. So I chose like some works from different points of her career. And she always liked to, she always loved strong female protagonists for her stories. Protagonists who would be troublemakers. Protagonists who would be the wicked women, or who would not accept what was expected of them, but who would try to create their own space of freedom and emancipation. So these are some of the these are some notable works by her. I'm going to talk about one particular work, Lihaf. So, by the way, Lihaf, her works have been adapted by Bollywood a lot. Even Hollywood, to a certain extent. Deepa Mehta's Fire, the controversial film that explored Indian lesbianism, is loosely inspired by the works of Chugtai. Vishal Bharadwaj, another noted Bollywood film director, made a movie recently, about 10 years back. It's called Dare Ishqiya. Also has very identifiable references to this particular story, Lihaf. Lihaf is an Urdu word for the quilt. It's like a blanket, it's a quilt, right? And the whole thing is like, the question is, what happens within the confines of the quilt? Something that cannot happen in the public or in the open would happen underneath a quilt. So this story was published in 1942 in Adab-e-Latif, a Lahore-based Urdu literary journal. Lahore was then, this was before, she was writing again before Pakistan was created. So she was writing technically in British India, but Lahore today is in Pakistan. So again, she is another figure whose glory both India and Pakistan share. So again, that's why I did not do Indian, I did South Asian. So this story, again, a short story, it chronicles the sexual awakening of Begum Jan. Begum is a title that is often, that means queen, but is often like, I mean, yeah, there is some sort of a royalty involved. So this protagonist in the story is a royalty, but like not in the sense that we knew like kings and queens, but royalty just in the sense of a title today, right? Begum Jan. Uh, so she has, so Begum Jan has a very unhappy marriage with Nawab, who's the king. Mainly because Nawab is himself closeted gay, who cannot come out. So this is a marriage for the society, just to show that we are married. But behind the veil, there's something different going on. The Nawab is, of course, really not interested. So Begum develops this unique sexual relationship with her masseuse, who massages her, but then it gets really intimate. And that's why we have the quilt, because the massage happens inside the quilt. So nothing is really evident, but everything is suggestive. And the story is presented from the point of view of a little girl who doesn't really understand what is happening, but sees the quilt moving like the shape of an elephant on the wall, projected against the wall. She doesn't know what's going on inside the quilt, but the audience know without needing suggestive language. Again, this story when it was produced, attracted criticism for his suggestion of female homosexuality. Chugtai was summoned by the Lahore High Court to defend herself against charges of obscenity from this short story. Ultimately, she won the case, though this gave her a lot of headache and infamy. She won the case mainly because the story does not use any explicit language. Everything is suggestive. Nothing is explicitly mentioned. There is no sexual language. But, however, I must point out that the story is not just about lesbian relations. It's a story about power. It's a story about how relationships are determined by unequal power dynamics. Again, it is a story about the love affair between Begum and her masseuse, but then again, there's an economic difference too. So yeah, okay, I wanna I'll take like 5 more minutes before I conclude, but I do wanna quickly touch upon this last figure, who is another phenomenal writer. And Chugtai, just one last thing about the last order, Chugtai. I mean, she was talking about sexuality, same-sex relation politics in the middle of 20th century. The country was obviously, India was obviously not prepared to have that conversation at that time. Not just India, but I would say globally. Nobody was prepared to have that conversation at that time. But again, today in India, there has been a lot of progressive attitude toward same-sex relationships. And I would like to think that had something to do with the activism and the writings of somebody like Chugtai. Okay, our last literary figure Mahashata Devi. She lived between 1926 and 2016. She was a Bengali writer and an activist. Again, she was a leftist. She was a Marxist who worked for the rights and the empowerment of tribal communities in India. Tribal communities are, again, one of those groups in India whose rights are the most neglected. They're often overlooked, who are economically, socially doing the worst among any other group. So Devi dedicated her life to serving them. She actually went and lived with many of these tribal communities. The tribal communities that she worked with were the Lodas of the Midnapur district and the Keria Sabars of Purulia. These are all little districts within Bengal and the borders of Bihar, different states in India, towards the east part of India. And her contributions and her work with tribal communities earned her the title of the Mother of the Sabars. She was engaged in activism because post-independence, the government of India invested in a lot of decolonization, what they called were decolonization projects, which was in collaboration with global institutions like the World Bank. So they wanted to build roads, they wanted to build buildings, they wanted to build cities, dams. But what was happening was they wanted to build these infrastructures on lands that were traditionally occupied by the Adivasis and the tribals. So the government enacted immense violence upon many of these communities. So Mahashata Devi was an vocal activist for the cause of, my cat is kind of, he needs a little attention from time to time. So yeah, so she dedicated her life to bringing visibility to the stories of many of these tribal lives. Notable works include Hajar Chaurasiya Ma, Rudali, Aranya Din Ratir, Aranya Adhikar. So these are, again, where like I'm kind of like code switching and it kind of becomes a little difficult at times. So yeah, these are some notable works. Again, many of her works have been made into films, not just regional films in India, but also Bollywood films. So, and the image that you see is the Mahashata Devi Memorial, which was unveiled at the Adivasi, the tribal academy at a tribal of Tejgarh in Gujarat. So again, her contributions are immense, not just her writings, but her activisms in general. And Draupadi is one of her most noted works. Draupadi is a reference to Draupadi from the Hindu epic Mahabharata. Draupadi was the famous figure who was publicly raped by different parties at war, like by men at the court in the epic, at a court. So she was publicly humiliated. Her clothes, her clothes were taken off, torn apart to make a political point. So Draupadi becomes a central figure in Mahashata Devi's story in exploring the violence against the tribal communities from the region. And again, when I say violence against tribal community, the violence was disproportionately targeted against women. So again, women being the recipients of that kind of the brutal force of the army, of different forces of the local powers who wanted to exterminate or get rid of this inconvenience in these regions, so that decolonization projects, so that roads could be built, right? So the story is against, it is set against the politically charged climate of West Bengal in 1971. This was when Bangladesh assumed freedom of some kind, freedom in the sense of like it kind of established its independent identity as a nation different from Pakistan, which was originally Bangladesh was East Pakistan, but this was the moment when Bangladesh kind of broke free from those restrictions politically. And of course, breaking free means death of thousands and thousands that happened during this time. India, and this was a time when both Pakistan, India, Bangladesh were involved in this war. There were many refugees in India. There were political turmoil. So Bengal was witness to a lot of this violence. So this story has that background. And it is against feudalism and state violence against Dalits and Adivasis from the region. Okay, so with this, I would like to conclude. I mean, again, I made a choice, and by making a choice, I mean, I left out many important voices, women writers from India, and I've kind of like noted a few over here. On the left, from the left, there is Mahadevi Varma. She was a poet, and she was one of the architects of Hindi romanticism in modern, called the modern Hindi Chayavad. Then we have Kalki Subramaniam, another very noted writer, and she's also a trans activist. Janaki Srinivasan Murthy, she's a very noted Kannada fiction writer. In Kannada literature, we know of many men like Anantamurthy and Karnad, but she is one figure who is another literary giant in Kannada literary scene. We have Shantabai Kambli, a very prominent Dalit writer. So again, I can keep talking about their contributions, but I guess there's a point where I have to stop myself, and this better be that point. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much. There was so much in that. For those of you who are tuning in from Northfield, a lot of the books that were mentioned are in our library collection. So I would encourage you, if you are interested, to come by and pick it up and add that to your winter reading. To your TBR list should be filling up right now. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Roy? Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Everyone's like, I don't know where to begin. Okay, so we have a question in the chat. Arnab, what book would you suggest us as a starting point for someone to South Asian literature?
I mean, okay, so there are many ways of approaching that question. I mean, for me, I often try to, am more inclined towards works that speak to what I feel and what I do and how I feel about the world, or like what I am like interested in. So, and then I like, for somebody who wants to get introduced to the South Asian canon from a global perspective, for instance, I would recommend Arundhati Roy, God of Small Things. I would recommend Jhumpa Lahiri, and she has written like many short stories, Interpreter of Maladies, Unaccustomed Earth. These are are collections that have excellent short stories that capture, like Jhumpa Lahiri is a good, especially for somebody in the United States, I would say, is a good point to start off, mainly because I say like her writings capture what it means to be a South Asian in the United States. And not just like South Asian as a general category, what it means to be a first generation as opposed to what it means to be a second generation, what it means to be a woman as opposed to what it means. So there's so many different angles through which she explores the diasporic experience, right? There is Arundhati Roy. Again, she writes in English. She is somebody who looks at India, but from a global perspective that is kind to audiences who would otherwise not be familiar with India. So she writes about how India connects with the world. She writes about politics. She writes about the environment. She writes about identity. So yeah, that would be a great starting point. But somebody who wants to know about regional literature, I would, let's say, like if you're interested in Hindi literature, start with Mahadevi Verma. And that would like open like a world of new possibilities. Somebody who wants to get into Urdu literature, Ishmat Chugtai, is a great like beginning point, or somebody who wants to look into LGBTQI the literatures, Ishmat Chugtai is a good word. She's written like really good stuff. So again, like it depends on like where you wanna come at it from. In that, I don't know if that helped answer that question.
So I have a question. If so, you mentioned Urdu poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any written by women that you would suggest as a jump off point? I know that anything that I've read, I love poetry. I feel as though most everything that I've read has been from men.
That's true, and that's for a good cause. I mean, also like I'm looking at the chat, and Dr. Puru Kayasta, who was one of my dissertation advisors, is here. And she's a great feminist scholar and a sociologist, and she has some great advice, like Women Writing in India, volume 1 and 2 covers a lot of ground. And in fact, I have the cover of that in this presentation. I think it was like the first, my first present slide. How do I get rid of this box? Okay, this one. Okay. So this is an anthology that kind of gives you a good sense. And like the point that I initially made about rediscovering the past and going back and uncovering lost voices. This is an anthology that centrally does that. And it is highly recommended. When I was like initially getting into the field, this was an anthology that was like, that was the soul of my research. So yeah, I would recommend that. And as to your question about Urdu literatures, I've been like mainly focused in the works of Chugtai. There may, I can get back to you on that. I'm not aware of many more. I'm sure there are. Again, this like, just because I don't know that it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. But I'm sure there are. Uh, and again, Dr. Purika says Zuban books are really good for recent writings and across intersections of languages and backgrounds. So, and there's another, I'm forgetting the name. There are some really good literary websites that are coming up.
Oh, well, yeah, if you share them with me, and
I will. There is another one called The Queer Ink. It is on the one hand, Queer Ink spotlights literatures, LGBTQ PIA literatures that are being produced in India, but it is again spotlighting many also literatures that are being written in different languages other than English as well. So that's another. I can send you a list of these websites too.
That would be fantastic. I think it happens at the public library in our small towns in America, and just in general in the publishing industry, that we get stuck reading the same books because it's what the publishers are pushing onto us. And so to have different publications that I'm looking at as the librarian can help us all in the community to broaden just that selection.
Yeah, and that is the kind of thing that we do. Like we are constantly in our work discovering new canons. And once we become aware of a new canon of writing, it's like a rabbit hole that one can fall into. So, I mean, like, just like doing this talk, like kind of, I kind of like was surrounded by works that I did not know a lot about. And this work, for instance, that I talked about right at the beginning, oops, sorry. Yeah. Is one of them. Radhika Satvana, Appeasing Radha, something that I stumbled upon. And I felt that, yeah, it's not just like you just when you have a project like that, it's not very hard to do. I mean, there are breadcrumbs and you just have to follow those breadcrumbs. But yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing we do. We fall upon new stuff, and that opens up new worlds for us. And I think you're doing a fantastic job. The titles that you showcase in your library, I think you're doing great work. And I feel that your institution is like especially in the age of misinformation and polarized politics. I feel we need reliable, good sources where one can really find information about things that we are not aware of, but we are very quick to make judgments about.
Yeah, it's interesting to just to immerse yourself in a completely different world than what you have known about or
Mhm.
experienced. My mother has been. I'm also acquiring a lot of these on audiobooks. So for those of you watching our Overdrive, we have more of these titles as well. And
Oh,
she's been listening to them while she sews
mhm.
and will call me. And it's great. It lights up some part of your brain that you hadn't really thought to explore different ideas or topics. And in doing it in fiction and in literature, we can empathize. We can form some kind of connection to these stories.
Exactly. And thank you for bringing up empathy because that's one of my research topics, and I like that's something that I work on. Like the idea that can reading literatures can that make us kinder, and I think it does, and there is research to support that. I mean, of course, not just reading one kind of literature, because that can just feed into somebody's delusions. But I would say reading like a variety of different kinds of literatures, a variety of different perspectives that one is not aware of, can make one kinder to somebody else's who does not share the national origin or the culture or the language or the gender, can make one sympathetic towards strangers. And by the way, I just wanted to show you some of these books that I like, the ones that I talked about. This is a recent copy of that I purchased of Sultana's Dreams. I mean, it's crazy because I got this copy just last month. Up till now, I was using a free online version. By the way, UPenn has a free uh, has made Sultana's Dreams available. It's for free. You can just go and read it. And that was great for my students because they didn't have to buy this book. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, just like Sultana's Dreams, like it opens up new possibilities and new ways of imagining. Like there's somebody from South Asia who wrote a work that is probably one of the first feminist utopias written in a language. I mean, I say one of the because there technically was a work that was not really identified as utopia but resembled one that dates back from the 16th century in England. So that's why I said one of the first and not the first. But if you look at utopia proper, feminist utopia proper, because I mean utopias have existed, so right from Thomas More's Utopia from 16th, 17th century, or uh, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travel. Uh, but a feminist utopia, not so much. Oh wait, this is a question. Distinction. How does distinction? Modernity and tradition. Oh, nice. Um, yeah, as I said, modernity and tradition is a raging topic that not many people agree about. Like, is modernity good? Is westernization good? I mean, if you ask me, I would say yes. But not many do. and there's like it's a polarized topic of discussion, like, and I kind of skipped through some power presentations, a couple of things. The image you see over here, it's from Shakespeare's Tempest. It features Prospero, Miranda, and Caliban, three central figures from that, from Shakespeare's play. Now, now these figures have become symbolic culturally, especially when we talk about literatures that are produced from colonies that were colonized by some European power, like India. Like, so India was colonized by Britain. So Prospero, in Tempest, Prospero is tempest torn, and like there's a shipwreck, and he comes upon this island, and like he pretty much colonizes it. And the flora, the fauna, and with the flora and the fauna, the indigenous population. And Caliban represents that indigenous population. And in this image, you see a clear distinction between humanization and dehumanization. Caliban, the native, is almost animalistic. But here is the tradition and modernity discussion where it gets complicated. Caliban learns Prospero's language. Prospero is the colonizer. He is the European colonizer who has colonized parts of Africa, South Asia, Asia, Latin America, and brought their particular language and culture with them, right? That's supposed to, so clearly, there's supposed to be a clear reaction against that language. It is a colonizer language. But Caliban learns that language not as a sign of subservience or subjugation, but as a sign of protest so that he can curse back Prospero. And that is why the status of English is complicated in a place like India. Yes, it was originally introduced as a language to make the functioning of British colonizers or British bureaucracy in India easier, right? Clearly, like, I mean, you imagine British officers coming to India and having to learn Sanskrit or Persian to effectively rule, because those were the official languages in the 18th, 19th century. Official languages, by official, I mean language in which documentation and policy existed, right? So soon the British realized that it's easier to just invest in English and educate these natives so that our lives become easier and we can carry on in English, right? So what happened was schools opened up, universities opened up, curriculums were introduced that centrally aimed at bringing English and Western education to Indians. Not to liberate them or anything, just to make the bureaucratic processes easier. However, you cannot introduce a culture and expect the recipients to mindlessly get indoctrinated because they realize the potentials, because they were reading Rousseau, they were reading some of these philosophers of the French Revolution and of the different revolutions who were preaching about freedom, who were preaching about emancipation. And they realized what is happening in India is pretty much opposed to it. So English became thus a language of resistance where many of these colonized became like the Caliban figure to reply back. The whole idea, there's an idea called the empire writing back. And women came to the forefront, right? So for many, it was, I mean, colonization affects people in different ways. For many people, English became such an overpowering language that they lost touch with some of the vernaculars that could have resulted in a sort of alienation. But at the same time, it also resulted in a kind of an empowerment. So tradition and modernity have often been topics that have been debated on. Some women writers, including, have said, no, we must think back to our cultures. We must go and revive those pre-colonial cultures as they were before the British came. Others said, no, we must embrace this new reality because this is who we are now. And that has kind of been embraced by many of these texts that we have talked about, right? In Sultana's Dreams, there is Ladyland, this utopian society where women are the rulers. Women are scientists. They discover solar energy. They have found a cure to drought. They have cured the environment with their scientific inventions. But at the same time, they have not given up on tradition. But for somebody like Ruqayya Hussain, it's embracing these two different elements. Similarly, for Chughtai, she does not give up on tradition. She is very traditional in the way she sees middle-class Muslim families. But then she also feels that traditions must adapt themselves to times. Mahashweta Devi also thinks about traditions and modernity at the same time. She thinks there are some aspects of traditions that must be discarded, like the old feudalisms that oppressed the Adivasis, that oppressed the Dalits. But if you think back to history and rediscover it, you will find within traditions many grains of freedom and emancipation, which must be embraced moving forward, because both those forces of traditions and modernities are a part of your identity. I think I kind of got lost, Simone. I hope I was able to answer your question to a certain extent. But my basic point is modernity and tradition have been topics that have been hotly debated in India. But at the same time, I would say, even irrespective of disagreement, this is my other cat, he I think also needs some attention. Irrespective of those disagreements, people have learned to embrace the positives of both. Hope that answers your question.
Does anyone else have any thoughts that they'd like to share or questions?
By the way, Simona, that was a great question, though.
So it's interesting, just reading and thinking about globally what authors put out there, let alone female authors, and the backlash that can come into a personal life. I mean, there's a lot that we don't talk about, and these women are talking about the stuff that you don't talk about, and then just writing it out there. So historically, what kind of persecution did women face? Was it more so being ostracized? Was there legal repercussion for writing truths and putting them out there?
Yeah, I mean, like, still is for any dissenting body across genders. I mean, we're seeing this in, like, globally, I would say, right? Like, those who disagree get fired left and right from their jobs, get ostracized, and then their careers, their lives are often threatened. And again, something that has disproportionately affected women, because there's a scholar, her name is Gayatri Spivak. She's a prominent historian, literary critic, philosopher, and she says she uses this term. It's a Marxist term. It's called subaltern. Subaltern comes from the Marxist scholar Gramsci, representing oppressed class in general. So Spivak identifies women from South Asia as doubly subaltern. I mean, women, particularly women who are coming from underprivileged background, from lower classes, lower castes, from non-heteronormative identity spectrums. They are doubly subaltern because, of course, those other facets of their identities are at disadvantage, right? Lower class or lower caste is making them already a subaltern, like men from those same groups. But they're doubly subaltern because there is another level of disadvantage just by them becoming women, right? And women, at least, for instance, have faced persecutions. Ishma Chugtai was taken to court because of the story Lihaf that she wrote. I mean, it was her good luck that she won the case because she had the right arguments. But again, that move was targeted to end her career. And again, like, women face challenges all the time. Like Ruqayya Hussain, she she was just like, she got an opportunity to publish when she published because of the patronage she got by her husband. Because society wouldn't otherwise recognize you to independently publish your work, or it would be very hard. And that is just at the level of profession, right? Just for a woman to overcome domestic social hurdles and just coming forward to make a mark, it's like very challenging even today. I mean, why do we see disproportionately men in all spheres of representation? Because of this. Like we talked about the writings of Muddupalani. She was a courtesan, a dancer at a court, but like many courtly traditions were hubs for literary innovations. So the singers, the dancers, the musicians of the court from southern India and other parts too were often not just singers and dancers, they were philosophers, they were literary scholars. But that also worked disproportionately for men over women. We know more court artists who are men than women. Muddupalani was one example who has been suppressed, but there are many others like her, suppressed by voices of patriarchy, who feel that her poetry is not worthy of publication because it deals with sensitive sexual topics that should not be heard by a woman, let alone be uttered by them, right? And it's not just patriarchy that exists locally. Many of these patriarchies were matched by Western patriarchies, right? The British made it a point that Muddupalani's works were vanished. They were censored. They were banned from libraries or from circulation. So Muddupalani is not just one example. Again, her situation is symbolic to the situation of many different parts, right? Now, Rokeya Hussain was an avid advocate against the Parda system, a system of veil that was, again, it was a tradition within Muslim households, but it was also adopted in many Hindu households too. So it was a system that separated the house and divided the house between public and private spheres. So the inner chambers of the house would be for the women, whereas the outer chambers would be for the men. And because of the Parda system, many women were not allowed to go out and get education. And that would make you appreciate the canvassing that Rokeya Hussain had to do to get Muslim girls out to come to her school. Now, again, I do not want to like sound too one-sided politically, because there are other writers who have made the argument that by itself, the Parda system was not oppressive, but it became oppressive under a patriarchal regime. right? Because there are many examples where the Parda system have the space that Parda provides also provides a space of empowerment for women, where women could gather and congregate and unionize, right? And an example of that you see in Ishmat Chughtai story, Lihaf, the quilt, right? In the quilt, the Rani, Begum Jan, she has a loveless marriage with uh, her husband, Nawab. And she is from a family that strictly follows the Purdah. Purdah, which is assumed as oppressive. But what does she do? Does she give in to that oppressive situation? No. She reclaims the Purdah and makes it a space of empowerment and desire for her. And she forges a relationship with her masseuse, who is there to massage her. Again, Chughtai reminds her that often love and politics are not right wing or left wing, because those gestures of empowerment can easily become gestures of exploitation. So while her text is something that is groundbreaking for same-sex relationships in India, it also shows how quickly Begum starts reproducing certain oppressive patriarchal ideologies and practices upon the little girl who is within the Zanana and upon the masseuse. There are very disturbing scenes of domestic abuse and even rape in the story. And it is a story that I particularly find valuable to teach, because it highlights empowerment of sexuality, but it also highlights how relationship is not something that one ideally imagines. It is determined by power. It is determined by economy. It is determined by money. And it has good moments, but it can quickly descend into something very ugly. And her story represents that. But again, it shows that how the Parda can itself be a space of empowerment. So again, my point is that women have faced many challenges in different spheres, domestic, professional, they are still facing. That's why the term doubly subaltern is so valid. But at the same time, it's all the more noteworthy to bring those voices and to make visible those efforts, because they have overcome such hardships and still been those defenders, those advocates upon whom democracy has been hinged. I mean, we see women in the United States, and honestly, if you think of how is this democracy even happening and still surviving, it is because of women at the grassroots level who are fighting, struggling beyond all odds to ensure that the weakest and the most vulnerable and the most socially and economically challenged individuals of society still have a voice and a say in society. Hopefully that answers the question. It was a very long, circuitous attempt.
Yes, it does. And thank you. I appreciate your time this evening. And I
pleasure.
have a whole list now of books to look into, names to read up on more. I'm excited about that. I'm excited for all of you who are in the area. Stop by the library. I know I have a stack already on our World Cultures table right now. And there's going to be more that we'll be adding to it after this. This is great.
Thank you so much. I think you're doing great work, and this is it's very important. And thank you for having me over.
Well, I appreciate it very much. If we do need to wrap up, so I'm not sure if anyone else has any other questions. I don't see any here. So I will have this, I've been recording us. So I will have a copy of this recording up and available. I'm
Awesome.
looking forward to going back and listening again too. I really love the way you speak to.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, all of it. It's amazing. I appreciate your time. So you'll see a copy of this recording on our website at nflibrary.org, and I'm sure we'll be talking more as we go in the future.
That'll be awesome. Thank you so much, Aubrey. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I'll see you back at the library.
Bye.
Bye.